Let's take a look at this from CNBC. Joe Biden calling for changing the Senate rules, killing the filibuster in order to protect a corrupt system in many respects that violates the federal constitution, some state constitutions, and just a fair process. Go.
Are you on the side of Dr. Martin Luther King?
Oh, and by the way, you might remember this guy. He's Shepard Smith. Go ahead.
Wallace. That question from President Biden today as he called for carving out an
Looks like he's had some face work, by the way.
Exception to the filibuster to pass new voting rights laws. Speaking in Georgia, in the cradle of the civil rights movement, he said Republicans left his party with no other option after they blocked all attempts to pass the bills. The president also accusing...
Now, no time will Shepard Smith or any one of these talking heads of the left tell you what's in the bill. It's a voting rights bill. How can you be against a voting rights bill, right? And so the media play their role. Go ahead.
...of trying to suppress votes.
It's no longer about who gets to vote. It's about making it harder to vote. It's about who gets to count the vote.
Well, let's stop there. Is there somebody who doesn't get to vote who's allowed to vote? It's making it harder to vote. It's never been easier to vote. This isn't 1965. This is 2022. Try and stop somebody from voting. See how far you get. The problem is who gets the vote, and that's not an issue anymore. Who counts the vote? Now, as you listen to this a little differently. How he's trashing the system. And when Donald Trump raises questions about what took place, they trash him for raising the questions about what took place. You guys follow what I'm saying? On the one hand, they're condemning the system. On the other hand, they defend the system if they win. Go.
And whether your vote counts at all.
Ending the filibuster, or at least changing the rules for this case, would require 60 votes in the Senate, which Democrats appear not to have. 19 states enacted nearly 36 laws last year that made it harder to vote.
Now, see that? That made it harder to vote. We're not saying 19 states passed laws that brought regular process back to voting since we are post-pandemic. Why doesn't he explain what those states have done? Some of these states have had to correct what Democrat governors, Democrat secretaries of state, Democrat courts have done, in many cases elected judges, because the state legislature has the power under the federal constitution to determine the election process. But if there are all these glaring efforts to make it harder to vote, to prevent people from voting, why don't they give us the examples and speak of specific details in states? Because they either don't know, or they don't care, or they do know, and they know they're liars. Go.
That's according to the Brennan Center for Justice.
Now, the Brennan Center is named after Justice Brennan, who was a radical leftist on the Supreme Court. And Eisenhower said it was the worst appointment he ever made, because Brennan had been on the New Jersey Supreme Court for a bit. He'd been a Republican. And Eisenhower was looking for a Republican to appoint to the court. It was recommended Brennan. He put Brennan on. And as I say, he said it was the damn worst decision he ever made. And it was. So the Brennan Center is not some objective, independent authority. In fact, quite the contrary. Go.
Republicans control most of the states where those laws passed. In Texas, lawmakers banned voting measures put in place during the pandemic, including drive-through polling places and 24-hour voting. In Florida, they limited the use of ballot drop boxes and added ID requirements and other rules. In Georgia, where the president spoke today, lawmakers also limited drop boxes and made it illegal to hand out food and water.
Oh, wait, whoa. He does his best, folks. Banned handing out food or water to voters. No, they didn't. If a family member comes and gives you water or gives you food, you're allowed to have food or water. What they're trying to prevent is people from getting in that line and handing out things like barbecue sandwiches or corned beef sandwiches or booze or something like that as a way to persuade people in the voting line to vote for people they want to vote. In other words, campaign operatives and so forth. There had been a problem with it. So they didn't ban handing out food or water to voters. Just think about it. Why would you do that? They didn't ban out bringing a sandwich or a drink when you're going to vote. They ban people trying to influence you and create an atmosphere where they're handing out stuff, food, and drink while you're in line. Wow, that's such a burden, isn't it? It's such a burden, such an obstacle to voting. But he doesn't explain that, does he? In fact, he just cherry picks this piece and puts it up there. What he doesn't say is they've increased voting hours. They've increased the length of voting, early voting, in Georgia. And that the voting restrictions, quote unquote, that they put in place in Georgia are more liberal than the voting requirements in the state of Delaware, which is completely controlled by Democrats, which is Joe Biden's home state. Go ahead.
Waiting in long lines to vote. Those just a few of the examples.
Yeah, just a few of the examples. How about giving us all the examples? How about telling us what all the changes are? Notice he picks these Republican states. In Georgia's case, a marginally Republican or Democrat state. He doesn't tell you what it is you have to do in New York or California. He doesn't tell you that there they just mail ballots willy-nilly, millions of them at a time, to addresses where they don't know if the people are still there, if they've died, if they've moved. People could get multiple ballots. My radio producer, Mr. Producer, my executive producer, got 2 ballots. One at his old address, one at his new address. If he were a thug, that is, a liberal, and he voted both, how would he be caught? Because they don't want to follow up on ID laws either, or signatures. That's the problem. Tightening up, making voting laws more restrictive. You know, the language is key. Go ahead.
Senior White House correspondent Kayla Tausche on our top story tonight. Kayla.
What's she, 11 years old or something?
In Georgia today, in no uncertain terms, advocating to change those Senate rules to pass 2 voting rights bills with 50 instead of 60 votes. The Freedom to Vote Act would set rules for the mechanics of registration, absentee voting, and ID laws. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act aims to prevent discrimination at the polls by requiring federal approval to change certain state election laws.
Stop. Why are they doing that? The 1965 Civil Rights Act, which we call the Voting Rights Act, prevents states from changing election laws in a way that would discriminate racially. The United States Department of Justice, if they have the case to make, let them make it. But the Supreme Court of the United States said that these states that were under the 1965 Act hadn't violated the act for decades. And so they ruled that the federal government can't control forever these state legislatures. So they want to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act to overturn what the Supreme Court said. Now, if you're an individual and a state has passed a law, or a state actor, it could be local officials, are preventing you from voting or creating obstacles because of your race, under the 1965 Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, you still have the ability to bring a federal cause of action. Prior to the 1965 Act, you did not. So you still have the power, you still have the ability to bring a federal cause of action, a civil rights action, a voting rights action. So why are we doing all this stuff? Where are all the examples of this stuff going on? And incidentally, the Department of Justice took this act and applied it to counties and states like Pennsylvania, beyond the historically discriminatory states of the Old South. And the Supreme Court looked at some of this and said that the Department of Justice is really getting outside of its box in very significant ways. Go ahead.
Republicans have suggested instead modernizing the 1887 law on certifying electoral votes. But today, Mr. Biden, in a fiery speech, said there are no other options.
A fiery speech means he yells. That's all that means. Go ahead.
I've been having these quiet conversations with the members of Congress for the last 2 months. I'm tired of being quiet.
Tired of being
on the ground
quiet.
in Georgia, many activist groups were absent, protesting what they called performance art and demanding less talk from the president and more action.
All right, stop. This is not about expanding voting rights. It's about the Democrat Party making demands of the Democrat Party. That's why only certain special interest groups were invited. They won't come because they're radical. They won't come because they are demanding that the voting system be changed so they cannot lose. That is the bottom line here. This is one of the greatest attempts at a power grab in American history.
Want to see more Mark Levin? Go to LevinTV.com and subscribe now.